Hello, good evening, and welcome to tonight's edition of Conspiracy Watch. Tonight we will be discussing the education system. Now, this is such a massive subject area that we've actually decided to split this up into three separate parts. So in part one, we'll be discussing how the state took over the education system and the state's motives for doing so, as in how they stand to benefit. We'll look at the classic blueprint that the state has when they do this, and that will get us talking about Plato's Republic and the massive influence that this still has today. Then we'll look at what education was like before the state took control, and we'll finish today by looking at consequences in societal terms. In part two, we'll look at more personal consequences for the children and the parents themselves. And in part three, we will be discussing possible solutions and remediations that we can all apply for a better education for us all in the future. So I'd like to introduce and welcome Sandy. Hi, Sandy.
Hi.
Great to have you with us again.
Yeah.
How are you?
Oh, fine, thanks very much.
Excellent, excellent. You might recognise Sandy from previous videos on this channel, and I guess we'll kick off tonight by outlining, I suppose, how the state did take control of education.
Well, beforehand, could you just throw in your metaphor?
Oh, right, the analogy, yeah. Okay, yeah. Well, I like to think of today's education system a little bit like a monkey and a lion and a fish in a tree being near a tree, and some authority comes along and says, the first one to the top's the winner. For me, that pretty much sums it up. And as we go along, I'm sure that will come back into play. So we'll keep that in mind. Yeah. Thanks for reminding me of that.
Well, just to sort of kick off with modern state-controlled education system, it started in Prussia, which is a province in northeast, well, it used to be a kingdom in northeast Germany in the 18th century. With Prussian kings compulsorily imposing a 3 hours desk-based curriculum on all children in Prussia from the 18th century onwards, and it was from age 5 through to age 13. And that culminated in an edict, a compulsory edict in 1763. Prussia then became very expansionist and very successful, and it essentially then imposed the same system on Imperial Germany in 1871. And in response, Britain was quite frightened by this system, and the British state then compelled a full-time 3 hours desk-based education on all children in this country.
Was this the 1870 Universal Education Act that was brought in? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then the rest of the world, most states in the world have followed suit. So this is how, in the modern era, the state has imposed compulsory full-time education of 3 hours based variety on all children.
Okay. And so if we go from there to look at the motive, why, what reason did the state want to have control over our education?
Well, Prussia was a small state. It was surrounded by much larger states, and its motive, its monarch's motive, was in order to create an efficient state bureaucracy and an efficient state military by imposing a compulsory 3 hours based and certain amount of sports-based and ethical-based education on all the children in the country. Prussia was able to create a more efficient bureaucracy, state bureaucracy, and a more efficient army, and that was what led to it being actually expansionist and being able to actually take control of Imperial Germany, or take control of the other German states, and then impose its system on the other German states. So that's the motive, the state motive.
And it seems it's borne weight. You know, it's succeeded quite well.
It succeeded extraordinarily well. It really crushed the training of children in the trades, the arts, the crafts, this narrow curriculum. It also created, the intention was to create a loyalty to the state in children rather than a loyalty to locality and to family. And an obedience, if not a loyalty, actually at least a conditioned obedience to the state, because they are actually, the curriculum is being controlled by the state from age 5, and in most cases it is in fact a state bureaucrat or a state employed teacher who is actually teaching this education.
Okay, so if we have a look at the blueprint, the classic blueprint that the state has for doing this, where did it all start in regards to how did they implement it all?
Yes.
Yeah.
There is a classical blueprint for this. The state in the classical period that imposed a state-based education system of a similar variety was Sparta, classically in the 3rd century BC. It used to take boys away from the family into a boarding type education, which was sport or gymnasium and bureaucratic based. They ignored the trades, the arts, crafts. That was for a subsidiary, whole subsidiary race did that.
Just when they started the Olympics.
Hmm?
It wasn't when they started the Olympics.
No, well, I mean, the Olympics was being run during that period.
Yeah.
And of course, the Olympics does come out of a military athletic gymnasium training. So, and of course, Olympia itself is in Sparta.
Yeah,
so,
that's what. Yeah.
Yes, there is
when it started.
there is a connection. The alternative classical model was the Athenian state, where the parents had control over their children's education, and then essentially it was a much broader education. Obviously, if the parents were interested in being bureaucrats or being military officers, they would train their children in the gymnasium and in the 3 R's considerably. But the vast majority of parents and children were more concerned about the trades, the arts, the crafts, and that's why the Athenian state obviously had far more culture than the Spartan state. The Spartan state had this enormous reputation for military prowess, aggression, and it had this completely subsidiary slave race throughout the Peloponnese, which it had subjugated and used terror, state terror. The Spartan boys were actually trained to attack at night this subsidiary race to create an atmosphere of terror. There was also a very direct eugenic element to this, that in fact young children, Spartan children who weren't fit enough to fulfill this sort of military and bureaucratic training was simply hurled down a cliff.
Wow.
So it's a very, very unpleasant society, and it very often is presented as being a pleasant society, and people confuse Athenian culture with Spartan culture, and there is a very, very big difference between the two.
Whenever you mention Athenian culture, I get that beginning of the JFK speech in my head.
Do you?
Yeah. Athenian rule makers made it Solon.
Oh, Solon.
Solon.
Yes.
Yeah. But anyway, we'll digress at that point. So, can you give us any examples of how that translates to today? What the blueprint, how it still works today?
Well, to move on to Plato's Republic.
Plato's Republic, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Plato was an Athenian aristocrat. He hated Athenian democracy, and a lot of people misunderstand this, don't really realise this. And he admired the Spartan state, and he wrote this book called Plato's Republic, which is really the blueprint for not just our modern education, but our modern society, because education and society are synonymous. If you educate your children in a certain way, that then creates the society. The key to Plato was he essentially told the elite to take control of education, religion, and the media. And once you've controlled those major sources of information, you can then control power and property without people being fully aware of it, because you actually control the sources of information. So Plato's Republic it's about creating...
That hasn't happened at all today, has it?
Well, of course, there's in fact, most of our societies today, both the communistic ones in the 20th century and the capitalistic ones, control education, and they control the media. The elite control the media, and religion has become slightly more marginal. They don't need to control it, and in fact an awful lot of the religion is established church religion, where people can't really speak anyway. It's state-derived, it's Platonic in its structure, that people simply sit in pews and
listen to the middleman.
That someone mediates to you, an elite
Yeah.
mediates to you, which of course I think most people would question that early Christianity, or in fact any early church, would behave so autocratically. So they've basically got all the bases covered if they control education and the media and religion. An elite controls them.
So I guess at that point we should look a little bit, if we can, about the ways education was before any of this. Obviously, we're talking in between Plato's Republic and the Universal Education Act for this country.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, perhaps I ought to backtrack. I mean, if you want to check out about Plato, the best comment, you can either go and actually sit down and read Plato's Republic, which is it's quite extensive. It's quite long.
Tricky English, perhaps.
It's the translations can be a bit tedious. The best commentator that I know on Plato and on Plato's Republic is Bertrand Russell, who was probably the most famous 20th century philosopher, certainly British 20th century philosopher. And he wrote a book which is online. It's a large tome called The History of Western Philosophy, and he has one chapter on Plato, and it really explains that Plato is the blueprint for our modern societies. So, for instance, I mean, in the case of communistic and capitalistic societies, they're both ideologically based. Capitalism is basically saying we must compete, and communism is saying we must cooperate. And this really prejudices democracy, and it's intentional to prejudice democracy, because it should be part of the democratic process that the individual and or the qualified majority, through a system of informed consent, decide the degree in each area, each sector, that they want to compete.
Or cooperate.
And the degree in which, how much they want to compete and how much they want to cooperate. Whereas if you have an ideology already, it's state-based ideology saying you must compete or you must cooperate, of course they're prejudicing the democratic process before you start. So again, Plato is absolutely integral to Marxist, communist, certainly Bolshevist communism, and to capitalism, and they are both absolutely anti-genuine democracy.
So, what did we have exactly before?
What we have? Well, in the case of Britain, before 1870, the Universal Education Act, when the state took control, most children were actually getting a 3 hours education through what were called dame schools or voluntary church or chapel schools. And then in addition, because the parents had control, in most cases, the children were able to choose some form of apprenticeship, either via their parents or their parents' relatives or friends or neighbours. So there wasn't this narrow insistence by anyone that on a very narrow curriculum of the 3 hours based, desk-based curriculum up until 16. The parents had the flexibility.
Right. And of course today, I might be getting ahead of myself here, this might be something we cover a lot more in part 2 and 3, but of course today the parents do not get to see what the curriculum will be. They just go along with it. It's
yes.
It's there. That's how it is. They have no say.
Yes, it's not a free market. It's an autocracy or an oligarchy. It's either people at the top of the Department of Education or indeed the Ministry of Education, Minister of Education, deciding the curriculum for everyone else. And of course that's not democratic, and although they purport that it is, and it's certainly not a free market. A free market is rather more anarchistic. That is where in a free market the consumer and the producer please themselves. So essentially in a free market, education market,
I feel that's very little understood by people.
I mean, a free market, the teachers should be approaching of trades, arts, crafts, sciences, 3 hours, should be approaching the parents and saying, pretty please, would you care to do my curriculum? Would you care for your child to do my curriculum? And the parents should have the choice, and the children should have the choice.
Yeah.
And of course this isn't the case with the state curriculum, where it's a one-size-fits-all, very narrow curriculum, which is what ties in with your metaphor. That's why your metaphor is so good, because it's a narrowing of a curriculum, which means that only a narrow people with that particular aptitude are going to get to the top. So the
monkeys get to the top quickest, and that's it. Yeah, the rest.
That's it. The rest either don't do it so well, or actually really, really struggle. As soon as you narrow any curriculum, obviously it's only people with that particular aptitude who are going to forge ahead. So again, it's elitist.
And we will, in parts 2 and 3, we will get to solutions for this, and they existed for a long time, in fact. But we won't go on about that now. So to finish today, we should talk about the consequences a little bit.
Yeah.
In societal terms.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the consequences, obviously, of states taking control and imposing a 3 hours based curriculum with some sport in the afternoon is that essentially they are. It is a model for creating a efficient state bureaucracy and an efficient state military, and this essentially does lead to continual warfare of a Spartan type. That is, you actually have internal warfare where you're trying to keep the fish, the hippopotamus, and the other animal down. So there's this constant bubbling resentment and insurrection internally, where the elite is having to keep these people down, and which of course wastes a lot of energy and time.
And money.
And creates obviously a lot of unhappiness. And then, in addition, because they have this efficient bureaucracy military, there is the tendency for aggressive foreign warfare. And of course, it's no coincidence that it was the Germans and the Prussians who first adopted this modern model, and it was, of course, they who were the most aggressive country in Europe in the late 19th century and early 20th century. They actually really instigated the Austrian-German War, the Russian-German War, the Franco-German Wars of the 1870s, really based on this education system. People look about more immediate causes, but if you really want to look at a big background, the major background cause, it is this state education system. And of course, we've adopted this system, and we're now, the Americans and Britain and NATO, are involved in what I think George Bush called the never-ending war against terror. And they literally talking about it being never-ending. And of course, there's a lot of issues that we could unravel and unwrap about the war on terror. And now there's recently the re-emergence of a Cold War with Russia beginning to stand up to NATO, and it looks like we are getting the resurgence of a Cold War. So there are these very regrettable and utterly pointless and hopeless and useless things that come out of this very aggressive state control of education, which creates passivity in the population and obedience in the population, and people just don't say, we're not going to go.
And even though it's a very left brain education, logic also goes out of the window, I'd say.
Yes, and also, I mean, equally and oppositely, that sort of state-controlled education with this narrow curriculum and control means that there's been a huge degradation in the trades, arts and crafts skills over the last century across Europe. I mean, if you look at the trades, arts and crafts of a century ago, they are incomparably better than they are today. And this is because it wasn't being passed down from mother to daughter and from father to son, because the state had intervened and said you must full-time do a 3 hours based education until 16. So there's enormous degradation in skills, enormous degradation in just human life and humour and diversity.
And there's a lot of, I would say, almost pointless aspects of education that, going up to higher education now. People going to study business management as a university 3-year course, rather than learning it as they go within the business community, within the job, learning the skills as they go. It seems to me, anyway, a very backwards example of how we go about educating people these days. Same with marketing. If you're going to market a product, I don't think you need 3 years of education for it.
No, I agree. I think we'll come on to that in particular second and third parts. I think particularly the third part will really reveal how appalling the present education system is comparative to what it should be.
Yeah.
And I suppose the third thing is, I mean, we're getting back to Robin's metaphor again, that a narrow curriculum creates excessive elitism, because essentially only a proportion of the population are going to be good at it. I mean, if you narrowed the curriculum simply to sport, there'll be a huge quantity of people who simply wouldn't be so good at that. Whereas if you broaden the curriculum, you broaden the curriculum, you will find that far more people will find an aptitude or do have an aptitude in one or other area, and they should be able to major in that from really quite an early age.
And again, we'll be discussing that, because that is part of the solutions, is that we have the technology in order to give people the means in which they learn best. That is all available to us now. It's about making people aware of that, I would say.
That's right, which we'll very much cover in part 2, and particularly in part 3.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we've pretty much covered everything we've got time for in part 1, so please do join us again for part 2, and take care of yourselves for now. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.